Hello everyone, I'm Scott, and welcome to day 6 of Dominaria United spoiler season. Again, our focus in these videos is going to be looking at standard specifically, and not necessarily other formats, but we want to focus on what's going to happen post-rotation with standard. So before we get into the spoilers, a couple quick reminders. A special thanks to our sponsor here, Caffeinated Gamers. And if you like the video, like and subscribe to it to get future content from us. We're planning a weekly standard video, kind of look at the decks and how the stand format is going. And also, we publish a weekly standard article on the Caffeinated Gamers site. So let's get started. Our first card of the day is Paragon. For 4 mana, you get a 3/4 angel creature with flying that has one of the best abilities that we've seen in a while. That once each turn once during each of your turns, you may play a land from your graveyard or cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. If you do, it gains when this permanent is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, exile it, and you gain 2 life. So this has 2 really powerful abilities. First, it can ramp you. We've got a bunch of lands from Streets of New Capenna that you crack them and you can get a mana of any of 3 colors. So those cards are going to be really nice if you want to ramp yourself. You play one of those on turn 1 or something, or turn even 2 or 3, depending on where you are. You crack it, it goes to graveyard, you get your land, and then the next turn when Paragon comes into play, then you can crack it, you can bring it back, crack it again, and get another land for yourself. So I think that's going to be a way for white actually to ramp itself a little bit. That really doesn't normally happen in white's colors unless you're using a saga to go fetch a land through one of the sagas that we see. But normally we don't have other ways of doing it. The second ability, though, I think is the much more important one, because once per turn, okay, you get to cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. So we know that we've got the Meat Hook Massacre hanging around the format. We know that's going to be a negative for most aggro style decks. Well, with Sarah's Paragon, if you've got the mana and it can stay on the board, you get something killed by the Meat Hook Massacre or Infernal Grasp or any of the other number of black removal spells. Well, you can bring it back from the graveyard and recast it. And that's going to really push the game plan for white, I think, into another potential level as we move forward. So I think this is definitely, if there's a white aggro deck or even potentially the Boros deck, would want this card as a way of bringing back stuff from the graveyard, because the Boros deck, the mono white deck, the biggest problem they're having right now is all the great removal that's in standard right now that wipes out the board, and then they kind of stumble from there. Well, Sarah Paragon, this is an answer to that problem because you can bring those cards back from the graveyard. Our next card is Anointed Peacekeeper. For 2 colors and a white mana, you get a human cleric with vigilance. That's 3/3. Anointed Peacekeeper enters the battlefield, look at an opponent's hand, then choose any card name. Spells your opponents cast with the chosen name cost 2 more to cast. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name cost 2 more to activate unless they're mana abilities. Well, what we're seeing rotate out is some of the cards that were the white taxing cards, like the cards that we saw from Strixhaven and from Kaldheim, that the god cards that tax things. Well, we're getting a replacement for those in Anointed Peacekeeper, because and it doesn't require you to name a card that's in their hand. You just need to know that it's in their deck. And if you know the decks, you can choose anything. So if you're playing against a Planeswalker deck and you believe they're going to have Liliana of the Veil, you can name Liliana of the Veil on turn 3 on your turn, and then it costs them 2 more mana to cast Liliana. And then once they cast Liliana, to activate Liliana's abilities, it now costs 2 mana. So this is a very interesting taxing effect that we're gonna see, I think, throughout the next 2 years in white decks that want to tax things and slow down the opponent's turn. And you could choose the Meat Hook Massacre, so now it's cost 4 mana to activate. So that's going to be something that's going to be really, really powerful in preventing some of the strategies that your opponent has. So the problem, though, with the card is it's another 3-drop in white. And we've already got a number of good white 3-drops with Adeline, with Brutal Cathar. So it's going to be interesting to see where this fits in terms of how many copies you're going to be able to play, because you're going to want to play those cards as well. So this might work, again, well with Sarah Paragon, because that's going to keep ramping you potentially for lands. So I think that potentially is a good place for it. Our next card is Haunty Gin. And this is probably next to Sarah's Paragon, possibly the next best card we've seen so far today. For a colorless and 2 blue mana, you get a Gin with flying, and Haunty Gin's power is equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. Instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So we've seen over the last 5 years, going back to the original Dominaria cycle, we had Tempest Gin that did basically the same thing. It was an all-star in mono blue decks. And we've seen other Drakes and others that have this similar ability, that the number of instants and sorceries you have in your graveyard or your graveyard in exile gives power to this card. And with all the cheap blue spells that we have, and the ability to reduce their cost by 1, so now your 2 mana spells become 1 mana spells, and so on, it would be very easy to fill your graveyard with good cards early in the game. And if your opponent can't deal with Haunty Gin, then he can, in 1 or 2 turns, he can take out your opponent. So I think this is definitely a card you're going to see play, and Ledger Shredder and this together could be a really good combination of cards. Next, we have Aquarium Beastcaller, which is for 2 mana, a colorless, and a green. We get a Dryad Warrior that when you cast a creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Aquarium Beastcaller. When Aquarium Beastcaller dies, distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Aquarium Beastcaller. So it comes into the board as a 2/2, and then it begins to grow very quickly, because anytime you cast a creature spell, you get another counter. This probably is our closest thing that we've seen so far to a Luminarch Aspirant in this new set to kind of fill in that role. It is in green, so maybe we see a shifting towards more green-based decks, so we get these kind of abilities. And we already have Galagreeter, a card that does a similar thing when it casts a creature. So it'll be interesting to see how those two synergize together. But certainly green seems to be getting a lot of support in Dominaria United to bring a quality mono green deck to bear, or even a Gruul deck to bear for this new coming standard season. Our next card is Sten, Paranoid Partisan. So Sten is a legendary human wizard for a white mana and a blue mana. As Sten, Paranoid Partisan enters the battlefield, choose a card type other than creature or land. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. So this is another spell reduction card. Again, we've seen a number of these cards over the course of the Dominaria United set. So there seems to be this theme of let's get things out quicker for a lower cost throughout the set. So with Sten, you can name anything other than creatures or lands. So your planeswalkers, your artifacts, your sorceries, your instants, or your enchantments, any of those you can reduce in cost depending on what kind of deck you're playing. Certainly in a control deck, this would help you to reduce the cost of your control spells. So I think this is definitely going to see play. What shell it ends up in the end, That's going to be, interesting to find out as we explore Dominaria United Standard. Also with Sten, you can exile Sten and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step for a colorless, a white, and a blue. So if you want to reset the spell type that Sten is going to reduce the cost of, you can do that by exiling Sten and bringing him back to the board. And for 2 mana, a 2/2, very respectable body size. And again, that reduction cost is very powerful in essence giving you a ramp on the board in Sten's card. Next, we've got King Darian the 58th. And he is a legendary human soldier for 3 mana, colorless, a green, and a white. Other creatures you control get a +1/+1 counter. And for 5 mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on King Darian and create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Sacrifice King Darian. Creature tokens you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So yesterday I talked about this interesting combination of cards we've got in the Selesnya colors that want to create creature tokens, and this seems to be a card that really wants to go right in with Adeline and Tauren and Alanal and be part of a cycle of 3-drops that just build your team up as you go. So I can see those cards working together, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of deck forms around those 3-drops in those Selesnya colors. But this definitely, pumps your team by giving it that +1/+1. Next we have Danitha, Benalia's Hope. This legendary human knight costs 4 colorless mana and a white, and you get a first strike vigilant lifelinking creature that's a 4/4. When Danitha, Benalia's Hope enters the battlefield, you may put an aura or equipment card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield attached to Danitha. So one of the things that we saw from the Danitha card from the original Dominaria set was her interaction with auras and equipments. Well, they've kept that idea in place and put it on a stronger card with first strike vigilance and lifelink this time. And that ability to get a aura or equipment out of the graveyard certainly is a helpful one. The question is there going to be a auras deck that Danitha is going to want to go into? That I'm not sure of. It's 5 mana. That's the downside of Danitha. It's a 5 mana card. We don't see many of those played in Standard unless they're really, really strong creatures. And I'm not 100% sold on Danitha at this point because her real strength comes from the attaching of auras and equipments to it. So if we end up with some kind of equipment deck, which we do have some support here for in Dominaria United and previous sets, then she could be a really great card in Standard and an All-Star. But again, it's that question of, is there enough support for this to make it really work well? Next, we have our 4th in the Defiler series of cards, Defiler of Flesh. For 4 mana, 2 colorless and 2 black, you get a Phyrexian Horror with Menace, and as an additional cost to cast black permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost 1 less black mana to cast if you pay life this way. This effect reduces only the amount of black mana you pay. Whenever you cast a black permanent spell, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains menace until the end of turn. After looking at the other ones, this is probably the weakest so far that we've seen in this cycle. First, the effect only affects 1 creature. So it's not that the kind of things that we saw with some of the other ones where it was affecting the entire board. And even though this is 1 mana less and still a 4/4, it's just not so overpowering, given what we've seen so far, and Shealdred, and some of the other cards that we've seen in black. This is kind of, it's not great. It's not bad, but it's not great. And I'm not sure if there's a place for it in the current Standard that would want this card. Um, but we'll have to see. But it's certainly a card that people are going to try, and we'll see where it goes from there. Next, we have Lyanna War Green Widow. This is a card that was actually previewed a couple days ago, but it was in a different language, so I didn't want to try to deal with it in a different language. Now that we've got the English versions of it, we'll talk about it here. So for 3 mana, you get a spider with reach and trample. Trample obviously is a great ability to have on a card because when you attack with it, some damage is likely to go through, and that extra little bit of damage here and there can matter a whole lot. I see this really as a sideboard card in a mono green deck or that Gruul deck, where you bring it in against decks that are featuring flying creatures as a way of dealing with those creatures. It does have Domain 7 for 7 mana and a green. Return Lyanna or Green Widow from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It gains, if this permanent would leave the battlefield, exile it. Instead of putting it anywhere else, this ability costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. So it sounds like it's a lot of mana to bring it back, but most of the time you're going to have at least 3 colors in your deck because you're probably using the triomes that we saw in Streets of New Capenna. So for 5 mana, you're going to be able to bring this back from the graveyard. And that's a nice ability to have that ability to bring things back. So we could see this again, that idea of that graveyard deck that you keeps bringing things back. This could be a card that might fit in there. But I think the place that we're going to see it the most is probably in sideboards of green decks. Next we have Silver Scrutiny. Okay, this is a sorcery that costs X and 2 blue mana. And you may cast Silver Scrutiny as though it had flash if X is 3 or less. Draw X cards. So this is an interesting card in the fact that you can give it flash if you need it to early in the game to draw 2-3 cards, and then later in the game when you got a lot more mana, you can draw 5, 6, 7 cards if you've got the mana laying around to refill your hand with it. So that flexibility is what I really like in this card, because that flexibility is so important to pushing mono blue or Dimir or Azorius game plans. So this is I think a really good card draw engine. How many of you play, given the other card draw spells that we've got? Not exactly sure, but it's certainly something that I think those decks are going to want to consider. Is it better than Memory Deluge? Maybe, maybe not. Deluge allows you to filter. This doesn't. You just draw the cards that you put in the X mana value for. So that's not going to allow you to really dig. But the fact that you can push any amount of mana into it you want does get you a lot of cards in your hand. So I think we'll see some combination of the two in blue decks that want to draw a lot of cards. Next, we have a couple of lower rarity cards that I thought I should talk about because I think you'll see them certainly in limited and potentially as cards that might see some play in standard. First, we have Runic Shot for a white mana. It destroys target tapped creature. If you kick it for a blue, this spell is kicked, you get to scry 2. So destroying a tapped creature, we've seen that a ton over the last 2 sets because of the power of the Wandering Emperor coming in, normally flashing in, coming down, killing a creature that's tapped, that's attacked. Okay. The downside of Runic Shot, it is a sorcery, so you have to cast it on your turn, but you've got a creature on the opponent's side that's a large creature you want to get rid of. This is the way you do that. So it might see some sideboard play as we move forward. And then we have Bog Badger. For 2 mana and a green, you get a Badger creature that has kicker of black. When a Bog Badger enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, creatures you control gain menace until end of turn. And it's a 3/3 creature. Now, on the surface, it's a very generic, common card, 3/3, okay, for 3 mana. What I really like though about it is this kicker ability, where you've got a board state set up. Maybe you've got 2 copies of this in your deck, and then you're getting close to beating your opponent, and you drop this, you kick it, instead of having kind of a battlefield where you can kind of trade creatures because the opponent's got enough creatures to keep slowing you down. Well, now they all have menace, and then you need to block with 2 creatures to block anything, and that probably lets you to get through the damage you need to finish off your opponent. So not a great card, but the ability is interesting enough that I think some deck builders might want to include it. Certainly as again a potential sideboard card where you're going to want to have a way to get through damage if your opponent has a large board state. Well, that's it for today. And from here, we'll go into day 7 of spoilers tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to if you like the video, click that like button. And again, special thanks to our sponsor, Caffeinated Gamers. Thanks for staying to the end of the video, and I'll see you next time.